Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Harvey Mansfield. Tonight's event is co-sponsored by the Institute of Politics at the Kennedy School and by the Program on Constitutional Government in the Great Government Department in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Our guest tonight is Tom Wolfe, the novelist. Mr. Wolfe is a Virginian by birth and education. He was born in Richmond, and he took his BA in Washington and Lee, and then he got a PhD in American Studies at Yale. Despite these two handicaps, PhD and Yale, he's become a famous writer. Among his books are The Electric Kool-Aid Acid Test, 1968, The Right Stuff in 1979, A Bonfire of Vanities in 1987, and another hefty tome, more recent, 1999, A Man in Full. The theme of his work, one could say, I think, is manliness, the troubles and the triumphs of manliness in a time not friendly to it, and in a society unwelcoming of it. The time is a time of political correctness and therapy and victimhood, a soft, squishy time with nice, easygoing, tolerant, sensitive, and unmanly people. Our society is a society of business and commerce. Where is the honor in that? And yet, Mr. Wolfe seems to find it, perhaps in making a deal. He's always been interested in the race question. I think there's no observer in our country more attentive to the question of the relations between blacks and whites. And he's very good at seeing these relations from both points of view, from that of the white majority, ignorant and wary, and that of the black minority, determined to stand up and to call attention to itself. Where is manliness in America now? One could say it is in all of black America. Somehow blacks are both victims and aristocrats, suppliers of our song and of our sport. Well, I'm going to stop because no author wants to hear himself analyzed. There's magic in his words and prosiness in mine. But in his latest book, Tom Wolfe tells of Conrad, a manly hero who, unjustly put in prison, accidentally discovers a book of Stoic philosophy, since Stoicism is the philosophy of manliness. Tom Wolfe is a man on the inside, like a Stoic, but he's a man on the outside too, with the dash and the flash of an Epicurean. Tom Wolfe.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Professor Mansfield. You all know that Harvey Mansfield is a genius and a great orator, but I wish you could have seen the size of the piece of paper from which that marvelous oration was drawn. It's about this big. I don't know how you do it. It's great. It's great. Anyway, I want to start immediately with the night. It was February the 26th, 1988, that the term dissing entered the written language. It existed on the streets. It had not, before February 26, 1988, entered the written language. And therein, I think, lies a very revealing story. A man from Guyana, South America, named Arjun. He had only one name, Arjun. If your name's Arjun, you don't need more names. Had moved to New York City, and in the borough of Queens, in Jamaica, Queens, which is not far from Kennedy Airport, South Jamaica, Queens, he had bought a house in a rundown neighborhood, all he could afford, but this was his American dream. He discovered soon enough that his location was a very hot drug corner. This was when You know, the drug crack was at its peak as a saleable commodity in 1988. The word crack did not enter the printed language until 1985. So the crack was on the rise. Arjun reported the crack dealers on his corner to the police. The crack dealers firebombed his house twice and also threatened him with death several times as he walked along the street. But Arjun was a tough, determined young man, but in his early 30s. He wouldn't budge. And so to show the drug dealers that the police would stand behind a man who would face up to them in this way, the police put a patrol car in front of Arjun's house in South Jamaica, Queens, day and night. As you can imagine, this is not really the most marvelous police duty to have, sit in a patrol car for 8 hours. Well, one night, 4 drug dealers came by in a car, and at 2 in the morning, there was a rookie policeman named Eddie Burns was in that car. They came by at 2 o'clock in the morning, and they assassinated Eddie Burns. It was soon known, because they bragged about what they had done, it was soon known that this execution was on the orders of a man named Howard Pappy Mason, who was in jail at the time. And from his jail cell, or rather from inside of the jail, when he got to the telephone, he had told his lieutenants to go out and kill a cop. He had been arrested on a drug charge. Well, this immediately, as soon as it was known that this man had ordered this, it was assumed by everyone this was his answer. This was the drug dealers, the new kind of drug mafia's message to the police: you can't you can't deal with us, we'll deal with you. So it became a very big story, but no one knew until later, thanks to the work of a reporter for Newsday, Mike McAlery, exactly what had happened. What had happened was, in fact, not that Howard Pappy Mason was furious because they had arrested him again and because they were trying to protect Arjun. He was furious, as it turned out, over the following. One night when he was on parole and out on the street, not too long before that, he had been drinking whiskey out of a bottle in a brown paper bag and had 3 or 4 of his drug dealer underlings around him, and they were just hanging on the corner. A detective, a New York City police detective who knew him by sight, in order to needle him, to harass him, to put him in his place, and to show him who's boss, says, it's against the law to drink liquor on the street. I mean, what goes on in that neighborhood made drinking liquor on the street look like nothing. But he said, it's against the law to drink liquor on the street. You either go inside of that building and drink your drink, or I'm taking you in, you're going back to jail because you're on parole, and all you need is one offense, and you're going back into jail. The guy says, he just keeps drinking. So the cop says, okay, you've got 10 seconds to blast off. You have 10 seconds to make up your mind whether you're going to go inside of that building and drink your liquor, or whether you're going to jail. You have 10 seconds. And then he says, 10, 9, 8, 7. We're heading for blast off. 6, 5, 4, 3, and the guy buckled. Howard Pappy Mason buckled. And he went inside as nonchalantly as he could, having made the rational decision, okay, it's not worth going to jail over. But because he is a man, this rankled his soul. He could not get over it. He's sitting in his cell. He's now been convicted of another drug conviction. He's facing 25 to life on drug convictions. That isn't what bothers him. He's been in jail before. This guy faced him down in front of his friends. He dissed him. He dissed him, which is, of course, short for disrespected. Disrespected being the long form of the Germanic form of the noun, of the verb. He had disrespected him. This is what drove him to say, go kill a cop. He couldn't go out and kill that detective because he's in jail. Just go out and kill a cop. But these guys, they didn't know about Arjun. They didn't care about Arjun. They just saw this as an easy mark. There's this young cop sitting in a patrol car in the middle of the night, and actually he was asleep at the time they got there. And so they assassinated him. Now, this to me is a story that gets down to the essence of the male animal. It gets down to the essence of the male animal in the year 2000, as well as it did in February 26, 1988, and as well as it did in the year 1000. Now, Thomas Hobbes in the Leviathan talks about this. Sometimes I think, when I read Thomas Hobbes, or Thucydides for that matter, I realize we haven't gotten very far in the understanding of the human animal. I don't know if we've added a thing to what these people have already written. Here's what Hobbes says in Leviathan. There's a passage in Leviathan that's very famous because it is the passage in which he says that in a condition of perpetual war, and he explains what he means by that. In a condition of a perpetual war, it's each against the other, and the life of mankind, and this is in a chapter of Leviathan called The Natural Condition of Mankind. The life of mankind is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Probably the most famous quotation from Hobbes. But in a few paragraphs before that memorable phrase, he says there are 3 reasons why men go to war. And he said competition, by which he meant competition to seize property, to seize slaves. That was a very, very big thing not long ago in the history of the world, seizing slaves through battle. And seizing women, just seizing things that you want. The second was diffidence, by which is the same thing as fear. Fear that somebody else is going to attack you to gain all those things. But the third, and the most interesting to me, was what he called glory. And then he defines that, he says, or reputation. And the example that he gives of reputation, he says, is violence because of trifles, a word, a smile, a different opinion, or any other sign of undervaluing someone, either direct to their persons or by reflection upon their kindred, their friends, or their name. What a shrewd insight to the male this is, that the male will fight to the death, will kill over a slight, a trifle, just like the trifle of a detective saying, get off the street to drink your drink. Imagine your soul being, but I don't have to imagine, because I'll get to that in a second. I can feel it. I can feel it. Now, what accounts for this, this instinct in man? Well, here at Harvard, you don't have to look very far, because you have Edward O. Wilson, who is the most important thinker in the new field of neuroscience, which is now the hottest field in the academic world. Am I not right? Well, up to a point. No, I think it is. It depends on how you could define hot, but I think in terms of just the radiation, it's hot. He is also one of the 2 most influential thinkers in America. We're very fortunate the other of those 2 is with us tonight, and you know who you are. I find such a safety valve is important in an academic setting. Anyway, in the famous chapter 27 of the second volume of his Wilson's sociobiology trilogy, throughout this, what became an explosive book, the sociobiology, the second part of his trilogy, he's talking about animals and often simply about ants. After all, he is not merely a zoologist. He is not merely an entomologist. He is a myrmecologist. Is that the right word? Right. One who studies ants. Anyway, a lot of it's about ants. But in the 27th and last chapter, he speculates about the bearing that his findings will have upon humans, and he goes so far as to say, and which got him into a lot of trouble locally. I won't go into all that, but he got in a lot of trouble locally. He said that men and women, through the hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, have developed not merely great physical differences, which are so obvious, but emotional differences, so that the psychic makeup, the emotional makeup of the female is actually quite different from the emotional makeup of the male. This is still one of the most hotly debated subjects in really all of the various social and physical sciences. The question of whether it's genetics or social conditioning that creates the feeling of manhood or woman or womanhood. But just to give you an example of just how pervasive, and I'm personally am willing to accept the argument that it is in no small part genetic. But what does my view count for? Not very much. But I have read the literature. But just consider, read if you will, Edward O. Wilson's own autobiography. Fascinating. It's called Naturalist. Fascinating. Most of it is about his life in science and how he reached the theories that he's reached, and that in itself is I found riveting. But also, he has a chapter in which he recounts his growing up in Alabama and in Mobile when he's in his early teens. He tells how one day, despite the fact that at the military school they sent him off to at the age of 7, Edward O. Wilson went to, he sounds like a prescription for Columbine. He does. His family broke up when he was about 3, living with relatives, sent off to a military school, Gulf Coast military. How'd you like to go there when you're 7 years old? He then goes to 14 public schools in 11 years before he graduates from high school. He then goes to University of Alabama, which, in case you didn't know, it is not terribly high on the list of applicants with 1,500 or better SAT scores around the country. But well, anyway, I don't mean to get that deeply into it. But anyway, what he remembers more than any of that is the day that a group of boys who were bigger than he was, and there was about 5 of them, but this one guy challenged him to a fight. And he backed down and slunk off. And he said at the moment it didn't worry him because these boys were from another school. He'd probably never see them again. After all, they were bigger than I was. But he never has gotten over it. It's in his autobiography. We males do not get over these insults to our manliness. We just don't get over them. And he also said in another section of the book that he indicates that he looks with higher regard upon the Congressional Medal of Honor than the Nobel Prize. He says it is more mysterious and exalting. The Congressional Medal of Honor is more mysterious and exalting. More exalting than the Nobel Prize. And here's a man who is probably in line to get the Nobel Prize. One of the people he admires most in this world is a man who happens to have had a great influence on my literary life lately. James Stockdale. James Stockdale was the naval aviator who won the Congressional Medal of Honor for his leadership of the prisoners in the Hanoi Hilton prison, where, of course, John McCain also was a prisoner. Stockdale was the one who got the Congressional Medal of Honor for it because he was the leader. He was the one who never broke. Never broke. Under 8 years of torture, 4 years in solitary confinement. And he later wrote in his memoir that if he had not read the works of, or really just part of the works of Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher, when he was at Stanford on a naval graduate program, he was already a naval officer, he could not have withstood his 8 years in that prison, which was a horrible prison. It's influenced my literary life because I was writing this book, A Man in Full, and I had this young character, a working class boy named Conrad Hensley, and as a plot device, I put him in jail. I figured, boy, this will interest people, and so horrible things happened in jail, but he was the most boring character I'd ever. I mean, it was my character. It was the most boring character I'd ever read. I'd written all these chapters about him in jail, and it's because he was just a leaf on a raging tide, just a leaf on a raging tide. And so I went to a friend of mine named Tommy Phipps, a playwright, and I said, Tommy, I have this terrible problem. I got this character. He's very good. He's a very good boy, and he's boring. What do I do? He says, well, on the stage, when we get a boring male character, what we do is we give him a pipe. And I said, what do you mean? So you give him a pipe, he puts tobacco into it, and he lights it, and he starts puffing, and he clicks his teeth with it, and he puts it down, and he picks it up again. He says, pretty soon you got an interesting character. So, so I left that meeting trying to figure out what kind of pipe I could give this Conrad Hensley. And suddenly, in one of those mysterious things that happens, those leaps of sparks across the bell jar and all that sort of thing, I thought of James Stockdale's memoir, which I had read because I was doing a book on the astronauts called The Right Stuff, and I was reading pilots' memoirs. And I had never heard of Epictetus until I read that thing in Stockdale's memoirs. So I said, all right, Epictetus. Let's see about Epictetus. And so I've started reading the works, the discourses of Epictetus, and on the second page, Epictetus says, other philosophers will tell you that you have all these choices in life, and it's up to you to make the right choices. He said, I'm here to tell you, this is the time of Nero. He says, you don't have many choices. You probably have the heel of a tyrant on your neck right now. He said, you may very well be in jail. When I saw that, I said, hey, that's it. And so I had Conrad, my character, by mistake, receive a book in jail, which contains the discourses of Epictetus. The book is called The Stoics. He had ordered from a bookstore a book called The Stoics Game by a British writer who was my equivalent of Jean Le Carré. Wouldn't that be a good Le Carré title, The Stoics Game? Anyway, so he gets this thing, and he has nothing else to read, and he starts reading it. And when he himself sees this thing about jail, he self-converts to Stoicism. And at that point, if I do say so myself, Conrad Hensley became an interesting character, and he reads the story which is the essence of Stoicism, the essence. And this is what would take somebody like James Stockdale, or somebody like, for that matter, John McCain, successfully through that experience. Stoics have no dilemmas, no dilemmas. The essential Stoic story is that of Agrippinus, the Stoic. This is the time of Nero. Florus, the historian, his friend. Agrippinus hears this knocking on the door, frantic knocking. It's Florus. Florus says, my God, I've gotten summoned from Nero. He wants me to be in one of these stupid plays of his. I have to put on a ridiculous costume. If I do this, I'll be humiliated in front of all of Rome. If I don't do it, they'll kill me. And Agrippinus says, I've gotten the same summons. Florus says, what do we do? Agrippinus says, you act in the play. I won't. He says, well, why should I act in and not you? He says, because you considered it. Now that's the essence of Stoic of Stoic manhood. Now, as I said, or as I wanted to indicate, I never spin theories that don't apply to me. I hate theorists who do that. You know, usually they use the word "we" too, and they don't mean it. You know, they say, "We Americans feel that it's our duty," and obviously the guy writing it doesn't feel that. It's, you know, "we" means everybody except me and my friends. But I'm not that way. I'm better than that. I'll tell you about a personal humiliation involving manliness of mine that happened not all that long ago. I used to live on Beekman Place in New York, in Manhattan. One night it was snowing so bad that there were no taxis. I needed to get somewhere for dinner. I go out into the intersection, and here's this one guy about my age. I was in my early 30s. He's out there, his big black overcoat, and he's in the middle of the intersection looking in every direction for a taxi. So I knew that the only chance of getting one was there was a restaurant about half a block away, and that sooner or later a taxi would come up in front of that restaurant. So I slunk over in front of the restaurant, and pretty soon a taxi arrives. Next thing I know, there's this huge figure in a black overcoat is charging towards me, and he shoulders me, and he says, "Hey, I got here first." And I said, "You were in the middle of the intersection." He says, "I've been here for half an hour." And then he shoulders me again. I said, "Okay, look, this is a taxi. It's not worth getting in a fight over." So the door opens. Here comes these two old parties coming out of the taxi. I mean, they are slow. You know, the woman has gnarled legs and one thing and another. Next thing I know, this guy who shoved me with his shoulder runs around the taxi to the other side, jumps into the cab from the other side. Now he has the taxi. Now, what is it that makes me remember that to this moment? The fact that he outsmarted me and got the taxi? No. It's the fact that when I got bumped, I didn't try to physically annihilate him. To this day, I hate myself for that. Now, that's the man's psyche at work. I mean, and, you know, it would have been foolish to get in a fight over a taxi, but it happens physical fights happen all the time over taxis, and I hate myself to this day for not having gotten into that. So, incidentally, there is no equivalent of this for women. It is not that women do not fight physically. When I was working on A Man in Full, I was going to have this thing involving high schools. Don't ask me why, but I was. And so I spent some time at a trade school, a rough school in New York, with the help of an assistant principal. And one day, it's near the bell is about to ring for the close of school, and I see these girls filing out of the school, and they've got this shiny something all over their faces. I mean, their faces are glistening with some kind of glistening muck. And so I said to my friend, the assistant principal, I said, "What is that?" She said, "Well, they have obviously a fight planned." I said, "What do you mean?" "Well, somebody has a beef with somebody else. They're going to have a physical fight of these two groups of girls." She said, "Probably over a boy. And they put the Vaseline on before they leave school so that if they're scratched, it's not going to be hurt so badly." Same thing fighters do in the ring. They put the Vaseline on their faces so they're not as apt to get cut. So she said, "These fights are in many ways worse than a boy's fight." So the boys get over it reasonably soon after they've had the fight. So the girls never forget. But they'll have the same fight a week from now because they will not forget. So, but she didn't say this, but it was obvious that that fight is not over because one girl said to the other, "You're not as tough physically as I am." They wouldn't fight over that. They would fight over a boy or somebody who is cutting you out from a boy or whatever it might be. I recommend to anyone in this room, male or female, a book by an anthropologist at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Dorothy Holland. It's called Education in Romance. She's a feminist, and she started off with a study of why was it, even in this relatively enlightened era that we are in now, so many women in college still go for what are traditionally female jobs: nurse, librarian, teacher. Why? And she came across something which she said she had never anticipated: the boyfriend factor. She said, no girl majors in nursing or library sciences or teaching. Every girl majors in the boyfriend. She minors in library sciences. This is a tremendous difference. All right, now to the historical roots of the male, and it may become as a revelation, but boys don't think that way about girls. Do you know that? Anyway, but that's another subject. Now, the historical roots of the urge to manliness. Just 1,000 years ago, that's not all that long ago, that's 30 or 40 generations, 30 or 40 sets of mothers and fathers and children. It's not that long ago. 1,000 years ago, in Europe, and let's take England as an example, there were only 3 classes in society. The warrior class, by which I mean people who actually fought in battles. The warrior class, slaves. England was full of slaves. Many of them were Welsh. They'd go over to Wales, seize people, and bring them back. Dublin was one of the great slave centers in Europe, and all the slaves were from Wales. They get anyway. That was one of the main reasons people waged war 1,000 years ago or earlier. Why did the Romans wage war? Because they wanted to run all this land? No, they wanted slaves. Epictetus was a slave. He was handed over into slavery at the age of 10. And that's the way life was. Warriors, slaves, and clergy. I'll get to the clergy in a second. And part of being the warriors ended up to be the people who owned the land. The whole idea of an aristocracy was a warrior aristocracy. And the original aristes, that these prizes given in Greek times, were prizes given to warriors who had distinguished themselves in battle. The very root of the word aristocrat is warrior. The hunting was an integral part of being a warrior. And also you needed, when you got to, as far as the year 1000, you needed lots of land and livestock to be a warrior. People would pay for their armor and their stirrups and all their equipment with cattle. It took 300 cattle to outfit one warrior. That's 500,000 tons of beef. Or, if you'd rather, 250 tons. It's a lot of beef. So you needed a lot of land, and you needed money. Now, the purpose of the clergy once again brings us back to Hobbes. Guy's great. He says nothing will work in a society, no matter how many warriors you have, how tough your people are, where there is no power able to overawe them all. Now, part of the power that will overawe them all is military power, just the fact that this nobleman has more firepower. Well, they didn't have firepower then, but than others. But it's also that was what the clergy did. The clergy created the image of an otherworldly supra power that was in control of all of human life, and that was why the clergy was so important. And if you were of the warrior class, the aristocrat, you wanted, if you had 3 sons, one was going to have to run the property. He and the next one would both be warriors. The third one, make him a clergyman. They're really important to keep the overall over everybody. So they were just these 3. Now, we get to a subject I want to. I think is fascinating in the year 2000. Team sports. Where did team sports come from? I'm not talking about Olympic Games, which are almost always non-team sports. Not today, but originally they were. They come from about the 12th century in Europe, when they were literally running out of wars to fight. It was a temporary thing, but they were. And they began, but the whole life of an aristocracy was built on fighting, literally fighting. You know, not working for Goldman Sachs and dog-eat-dog competition with Morgan Stanley. We're talking about fighting. So they began the custom of tournaments. And tournaments originally were pitched battles with blunt, lances, blunted swords, and so on. And if you knocked, but they were these two sides, and they would go out there and just fight like mad. They're all covered in armor. And if you knocked a opponent off of his horse, you got all of his armor and the horse. That's another 500,000 pounds of cattle. It was a real fabulous reward was to win at these things. After the battles, after these tournament battles, as was true in the case of after the wars that were fought in Grecian times, like the Thermopylae, Marathon, all that stuff, which were just as fierce, incidentally, as anything was done in Europe, done in Northern Europe. There would be all sorts of games held. There'd be wrestling matches. There'd be chariot races. Chariots were incidentally never used in battle. They were status symbols that brought you to the battle. You come riding up and seeing all these horses, you know. But they would have chariot races. They'd have wrestling. They'd have all sorts of revelry. There was a sense that was released in men after battles, even if they weren't in them directly themselves, of exultation, of a feeling, an emotional surge that really cannot be duplicated by any other experience. And this crowing over victory in battle goes on to this day. After the 4 drug dealers killed rookie patrolman Eddie Burns, the reason they got caught was they crowed and they crowed. They exulted to everybody who would listen to them that they just killed this cop. This is the male animal. And you know, Freud said that there is just a thin crust that separates mankind from cannibalism. He said, far from being abnormal, cannibalism is so normal. And that only this thin crust separates us from it. Anyway, finally, so many people were dying in the tournaments that they put an end to the tournaments. And now that was replaced by jousting, which you've all seen in the movies, where there's just 2 guys, and it's rather highly structured, and you could certainly get hurt, but it wasn't a deadly thing like the tournaments. Now, let's get very much closer to home. After the First World War, there was a tremendous devaluation in the United States of the warrior class. Up until the First World War, it was considered not only an honorable, but a prestigious thing for a son of a prominent person to join the military officer corps. The reason Robert E. Lee, who was from a wealthy family with a plantation that, well, not that big, but this mansion called Stratford and all the rest went into the military service at West Point, was that he was the 3rd son. His eldest brother was running the farm. The middle brother, I think, was either a clergyman or a diplomat or something like that. That was acceptable. And he just went into the military because that was a prestigious thing for a 3rd son to do. After the First World War, the business and professional classes in this country began to steer their sons away from the military. I discovered this when I was working on The Right Stuff and looking into the backgrounds of the original Mercury astronauts. 4 of them, the 7 Mercury astronauts, 4 of them were the sons of military people. The other 3 were farm boys, essentially, or they were from rural areas. John Glenn's father, well, he wasn't really a farm boy, but he was a railroad engineer. I mean, blue collar or farm. It was all a farm country. That's who was left to be the American Military Officer Corps. There's now this split between business professional people, between the university settings, between scholars, others, and the military. Now we fast forward to after World War II, and the contemporary 21st century devaluation of manliness, which, as I've tried to explain, has its roots in fighting, in literally fighting in battle. By the time of the war in Vietnam, there was a coming together, a convergence of really two forces. One was this fact that the business and professional and academic classes had turned their backs on the military. They were not sending their sons into the military. The other was the fact that, and I'm not going to go into this, it'd take too long, but American intellectuals, starting right after the First World War, began to fall under the sway of European intellectuals. Who remembers William James today? Who remembers Talcott Parsons? Who remembers, let's see who else is in that, Peirce. Who remembers Peirce? These great North American psychologists, sociologists, thinkers, they disappeared down a memory hole, thanks to the infatuation of Americans with European intellectuals. When you get into the 30s, there becomes a greater and greater, the European spirit of irony, cynicism, contempt, particularly for things like the military. And in Europe, you could, after all, in Europe you had the example, the evidence of the First World War, which had destroyed a civilization. And an intellectual in Europe, with some justification, could strike this immaculate, aloof, sneering pose and say, look at that rubble, look at those cinders. That is what your decadence, your bourgeois decadence has brought you. And it had a ring to it. But in America, our intellectuals could not resist this stance. And by the time of the war in Vietnam, here were American intellectuals in the universities who were constantly talking about the descent of the dark night of fascism in America. I remember that phrase so well myself. It was always the descent of the dark night of fascism in America, as if any moment now there was going to be that knock on the door in the dead of the night, the descent of the knout on the nape of the neck. My God, I mean, it was terrifying. Well, Jean-Francois Revel, a French philosopher, came to the United States at that point. He wanted to record this event, the descent of the dark night of fascism in America. He toured the country, and he went back to France, and he wrote a book called Neither Marx Nor Jesus, in which he said, in America, I came across one of the most baffling phenomena in all of astrology. Astronomy, not astrology. Astrology, too. In all of astronomy. He said, the dark night of fascism is always descending in America. It only touches ground in Europe. He said, this is weird, really strange. Anyway, but he went on to say, the reason is, he said, the most influential ideas in American intellectual life come from out of, and this was his phrase, a Marxist mist. He said, there are very few Marxists in the U.S., and I think that was always true. He said, but a general hazy notion of the inequalities of the class struggle is what generates most of the important ideas in American intellectual life. Again, this obeisance to European thinking. It's not over, incidentally. So now you have a lot of young men in universities not particularly keen on going off to someplace halfway around the world that they couldn't even pinpoint on a map. Vietnam, where people are getting killed a lot. And you've got your moral authorities, because by now the intellectuals, as Coleridge predicted in 1830, when he coined the word clerisy, has now replaced the clergy as the moral influence in the intellectual life of a country. So we have the example of the elite young men of the United States dodging the war in Vietnam. Just to give you an example, in the West Point class of 1966, 600, I think there were about 650 or so graduates of that West Point class. Of that number, 16% died in Vietnam. Almost 40% were wounded, got the Purple Heart in Vietnam. Now, I don't know about all the Harvard statistics, but the Harvard class of 64 I happen to know a little bit about because of someone in that class whom I know who went to Vietnam. In the Harvard class of 64, which had about 1,200, I'm not singling out Harvard, we could go around the country, but I just happen to know this example, and it's pertinent, I mean, here we are. The 1,200 graduates, of which approximately 40 went to Vietnam. One was killed. His name was Bing Emerson, a direct descendant of Ralph Waldo Emerson, as I understand it. Another was wounded when he tripped over a field radio while running from an incoming shell. I made that up. I mean, it's not. I don't know how many were. I don't know how many were wounded, but it wasn't. I mean, you know, the figures obviously were nothing like West Point. You only have to look back to the First World War and the alacrity and enthusiasm with which young men leaped into the armed services at Harvard, at Yale, at all the major universities to see the difference. What was now lacking was any power whatsoever to overawe them all. The authorities that you would look to around you, your teachers, the great scholars, for that matter, literary figures, were all telling you that it was a fool's game. It was a mutt's racket to get into the military and go off to some godforsaken place and fight for your country. Everything was put in quotation marks at that time, for your country. At the 25th anniversary, reunion, 25th year, 25th anniversary reunion of that class of 1964, the Vietnam veterans, of which there were 19 at the reunion, had a rump session of their own, not scheduled by anybody. They were very quiet about it. They felt they had to really sort of hide the fact that they had been to Vietnam. They attended the service, which I gather is given at every union as a service in honor of those who died over the past 25 years. The name Bing Emerson was not singled out by anybody except them in their hearts as they listened. This is a different world. The accusation was always there, unspoken, hanging in the air. Did you dodge Vietnam out of moral scruples, or because you didn't want to get hit in the head by a bullet? And it seemed very odd to the graduates of those who went to Vietnam from the class of 1964 that in the spring of 1970, I realize most of you weren't born then, but that's all right. You can learn this ancient history. In the spring of 1970, the anti-war movement, the New Left, reached a crescendo with the killings at Kent State. 4 Kent State University students were killed by National Guard riflemen who really panicked. This was the high tide of the movement. Everyone was saying, my God, what is going to happen during the congressional elections in November? The New Left is going to disrupt the elections. We don't know. It could be hell. Oddly, by November, there was no New Left remaining. It was gone. Totally gone. What had happened? In the summer of 1970, the draft was discontinued by Richard Nixon. He kind of said, it's not working. And the New Left vanished. Now, I just want to give you 2 scenes, and then I'll try to explain why. One is, Brown University was a very strong center of anti-war feeling. very much a university where the New Left was powerful. After the war, the Brown football team was extremely weak. It was the doormat of the Ivy League. And the students used to revel, particularly the male students, in going to the games to laugh at the team. The marching band, and marching bands at football games, after all, are symbols of the military, the battle, the warrior heritage of sports, of team sports, because they're dressed in military uniforms, typically. And they're marching in a military fashion to a military drumbeat. This is all because team sports are a charade for war, in which you hope to introduce in a relatively harmless way the idea of menacing combat to young men. They began wearing things like bathing suits, not kidding. Anything that was ridiculous, they would wear as the marching band. Well, this began to really rile the alumni, also known as donors, who were used to another Brown university. So there was a lot of pressure for this band to shape up. So finally the band, we get to 1975, the band announces, yeah, all right, we know we've been too casual about this whole thing. We're going to really straighten up. And we're going to honor, this was before a particular, they announced this before a particular game. It was the time of the Apollo-Soyuz mission, in which the American astronauts and the Russian cosmonauts were joining their spaceships, Apollo and Soyuz, together for a mission to show amity between nations. So they said, we're going to honor the brave astronauts and cosmonauts of this mission with our halftime performance. So they came out dressed in what they should be in, the usual martial outfit. Then they separate into two groups. One is representing Apollo, one is representing Soyuz. But one, oddly, takes the shape of a phallus, and the other, oddly, takes the shape of a vagina. And the phallus group begins to go in and out of the vagina group. You can imagine, and this is all after an announcement, this is in honor of a brave cosmonaut and astronaut. All right, now the athletic director is really furious. The whole university's administration is furious. But the athletic director, whose name was Frederick A. Guyland, was especially furious, and he kind of laid down the law. So they apologized formally, and they said our next performance will be absolutely straight. So they gave a perfectly martial performance of the band. For 20 minutes. Then they said, in closing, we want to pay a special tribute to a man who has meant so much to the athletic program of our university, Frederick A. Guyland. They then separated into an enormous F, an enormous A, and an enormous G. And they began with could only be called a swishing formation, went up and down the field. All right. That's one scene I want to leave you with for just a second. Now, the scene shifts to West Point on a day that I went to West Point as a tourist. And if you go on a Tuesday or a Thursday, I believe it is, you can see the entire Cadet Corps in formation, march in formation, full dress. It's a fabulous sight. So I was in these bleachers along with maybe 30 other people, 40 people maybe, watching the Corps. And I noticed something very strange. They come in ranks, they're in lines, ranks. And the ranks, you'd see these heads going, it would be like, suddenly they'd be like, drop, and then the heads would go again. It looked like a broken comb. These were the women. Women, you don't really notice it so much. I mean, I never did until I saw this. Women are smaller than men. But they were dressed in exactly the same uniforms. They're carrying exactly the same rifles. They're just smaller. And 3 of the 11 companies were captained by women. And here were these mostly great strapping men, and out in front was this little person with this you know, M27 rifle that detects the sound of incoming shells and the far-off sound of enemy guns. I mean, it's incredible, huge weapons. And so I'm looking on. Suddenly I hear a man off to my left. He's muttering. He's saying, "This is ridiculous. This is absolutely ridiculous." It turns out he was an alumnus of West Point who had not been back to West Point since the integration, the gender integration of West Point Cadet Corps. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. So he starts looking toward the military people in the stands, and he starts saying louder, "This is ridiculous. This is really ridiculous." Well, the men he's looking at in uniform are in the U.S. Army. They are teachers at West Point. If you're an officer in the officer corps at West Point, you're not going to say, "Yeah, I agree with you. That really is ridiculous." You can resign and say that if you want. I mean, that's what people who feel strongly about in the military do. You resign, then you say whatever you want. But you don't even nod. You don't say, "Yeah." You don't even wink. So he's getting absolutely no agreement. His instincts are not being backed up in any way. So finally he turns to me and he says, "This is ridiculous. I was too enlightened to say anything. I didn't say anything." I mean, although to tell you God's honest truth, if the purpose of a military officer corps is to lead infantrymen in battle, there is something a little luxurious about this. I don't know if I'd call it ridiculous. I mean, if you can choose these great strapping 6-footers with all these deltoids and pecs and lats and traps and all this stuff, and you don't choose them, that's a luxury. I guess you don't really need them. But okay, all right. Now, just think, if you will, of those two scenes: the Brown halftime performance and the gender integration of West Point. We now reach the figure. This is very recent. James Webb. James Webb was, for a short time, Secretary of the Navy under Ronald Reagan. More important, James Webb was a Marine infantry lieutenant in Vietnam who received every medal short of the Congressional Medal of Honor that an infantry warrior can receive. He received 3 Purple Hearts, wanted to go back again. They wouldn't let him because he was too badly injured in the legs. Webb he wouldn't like me saying this, but Webb is really our de Gaulle, waiting to be summoned from the suburbs. Remember, no, you wouldn't remember, but de Gaulle, the great hero of the resistance, French resistance, is finally brought in to save the country. Fortunately for all of us, this country doesn't need saving. We are in such fabulous shape. It's just astonishing. So I don't think he or anybody else is going to be called in. But nevertheless, he's well worth listening to. He wrote a piece for the Weekly Standard, a conservative weekly, recently, in which it was entitled "The Feminization of the Military." And here is his psychological thesis. He said an entire elite generation, an elite of elite students, dodged the war in Vietnam. They are now the people who, because of their intelligence, their training, their education, are in positions of the highest influence in government, in academia, and for that matter, in journalism. Everywhere you look, they are. But they feel guilty over the fact that they dodged the test of warrior manhood in Vietnam. So it is in their interest. He says this is not conscious. This is not a conscious thing. It is in their interest to feminize the status of warrior. To say you don't have to be a man to be a warrior. A woman can do it just as well, particularly in an era of high tech, where these weapons are just fabulous and everything's computerized. But as the Russians found out in Chechnya, it really isn't true. As we found out in Vietnam, it really isn't true. As everybody finds out sooner or later, somebody on the ground has to do the equivalent of what the warrior did in the year 1000. And look at the jeering at your football team. turning the sort of ultimate cynicism of turning Apollo-Soyuz into a hookup. Hookup? Hooking up? First base used to be embracing and kissing. Second base was heavy petting, fondling, groping, all those things. Third base was oral sex. Home plate was going all the way. In the era of hooking up, in case you didn't already know this, first base is fondling, groping, and deep kissing, which today is known as tonsil hockey. Second base is oral sex. Third base is going all the way. Home plate is learning each other's names. I've looked in girls' filofaxes. They'll keep a record of their amours. And I'm not kidding you. I've done this for a book I'm working on. You'll see a notation like, guy in green Wu-Tang t-shirt. O, comma, 6. The O is a code for whatever they did. Because hooking up doesn't necessarily mean that it's always sexual. It doesn't mean that you actually went all the way. 6 is how good it was on a scale from 1 to 10. Or it'll be something like, stupid cock diesel who kept saying this is a real deal. TTC 3. TTC is that thing with the cup. You're just not as knowledgeable as I am. All right. Anyway, returning to our theme. Christopher Buckley, Bill Buckley's son, then wrote a confession called Viet Guilt, in which he confessed that he himself had dodged the war in Vietnam. His father had served almost thrice over in the Second World War, both in the infantry and in dangerous missions for the CIA. The CIA after the war, but he said, "We, all of us, though, who dodged, feel Viet guilt." Finally, we get to the figure of John McCain. And John McCain's tremendous popularity in unlikely places, namely among liberals and among the press, it's a redundancy to say liberals and the press. Just think of the popularity that he had in those two groups. Well, now we hear from James Webb again. This is just about 3 weeks ago. A fascinating piece on the op-ed page of the New York Times. This piece was worded far more guardedly than I'm going to tell it. But this is what, Jim, if I'm wrong, nothing I can do about it. This is what he said. John McCain is a very unusual military candidate for president. All the other presidents whose reputations were created by the military service were warriors who fought and won battles, who led large groups of men and won battles. Teddy Roosevelt, Rutherford B. Hayes, who was a great warrior in the field, U.S. Grant, of course, in the Civil War, who actually was in danger. He put his life on the line as out in the field. Andrew Jackson, the Battle of New Orleans, that's what made him, brought him to the presidency, really. Dwight Eisenhower, although probably he was not in immediate harm's way, was a great leader of a victorious army. He said, McCain is our first anyway likely candidate to be president of the United States coming from a military reputation, who is only a survivor. Now, I'd say he didn't say this bluntly, but he said he survived. And he said it's very hard to survive that experience, but that's his claim. And he said, I think many of the people who didn't go to war were struck by the homecoming in 1973 of these pilots as they arrived like Rip Van Winkle off of airplanes. I remember seeing it on television. And he went up to the commander-in-chief, who was Richard Nixon, and they thanked him for the opportunity to serve their country. People really thought, this are people who've woken up from some cryogenic freeze. What are they talking about? They were like people from another planet. And he as much as says that he, Webb, that it's the fact that they were not military assailants. They were not military aggressors, although that's why they got shot down. But the fact that they were survivors, people like John McCain, people like, for that matter, he didn't mention Stockdale, but like Jim Stockdale. And he said, this is very different. And he also said, McCain did not endear himself among veterans after that. He said he led very rapidly a movement to create a rapprochement with North Vietnam, which he did. And he said he showed great qualities. This was rather ironic the way he put it, but he showed great qualities of leadership because he made that thing happen against odds. The odds were the other veterans hated it. And they felt it was far too soon to be making any sort of emotional rapprochement with the North Vietnamese. And he said, and I presume he knew his figures, he said, contrary to the usual belief, George Bush and John McCain ran neck and neck among veterans, 50-50. McCain did not get the veterans vote in any wholesale numbers because of the fact that two things, this rapprochement, secondly, the fact that he had not been, and this is what also Webb says, he was not in the field. He never knew the South Vietnamese that we were supposedly fighting this war for. He didn't see them suffer. He didn't see the looks on their faces. He wasn't with them. Interesting. So he was saying, in effect, there's warriors and there's warriors. And we who fought in the field are the warriors. Those who survived get our respect. They are warriors. I'm saying bluntly something that was said very diplomatically. When I was working on The Right Stuff, I ran into the fact that, first I went to see an astronaut named Bill Anders, one of the most dangerous of all the Apollo missions, Apollo 8, first mission to go around the moon, leave the bonds of Earth's gravity and go around the moon. And all of them were, at that point, were test pilots. And I said, well, Mr. Anders, I guess being a test pilot is at the very top of the heap in flying, isn't it? He said, he had a little half smile. He said, try that question out on a fighter pilot. He as much as said, the fighter pilot's at the top. Astronauts, test pilots are somewhere down the line. And sure enough, the astronauts who did not go to Vietnam and who merely went into space, went to the moon, all those things, were looked down upon by the pilots who fought in Vietnam. And the services let them know that when they left the Corps of Astronauts, they should forget about advancing in the military. They were going nowhere. They were finished because they didn't go to Vietnam. The only one who made admiral was Alan Shepard, who would have been too old. He wouldn't have gone to Vietnam anyway. He was born back in the 20s. He wasn't going to go. So he was okay. To me, this is interesting. This is all the male animal. This is the male animal. This is the warrior. Now, today at Harvard, to bring things as up to date as I possibly can, I noticed there was a survey taken by the Harvard Crimson about student attitudes, just published recently. Now, I don't, you may not know this, but I am, in fact, an honorary member of the Lampoon. I am. And I'm not sure whether to trust a Crimson survey. But this one seems to have been done carefully. And this survey, among other things, showed that 80% of Harvard students would not serve in the military unless they approved of the cause that was going to be fought for. I hate to say this, but selective service doesn't send you a checklist. If it ever came to a draft, they don't send you a checklist. You're either in or you're out. Also, I bet this survey did not include this. Incidentally, you'd have the same figures anywhere you went. Stanford, Yale, Duke, anywhere, Princeton. You get the same figures, be the same, very same attitude. My goodness, how many students today at Harvard or any other university have ever met anybody who served in the military? Met one. You may have a grandfather. If they had put in, would you go out into Africa and shoot a gazelle? Moi! Forgetting that hunting and warrior and being a warrior is historically inextricably combined. But finally, the thing that I love the most: sports. Sports. Are we running over time? We're running over time. Just one last note. Sports. What is this sports craze in America today? Now, you don't have here Division I basketball, but I've been over the past year to a lot of big universities that have Division I basketball. And I can tell you with great authority that basketball players at a Division I and a Division I program rank above everybody on the campus. There is nobody, certainly not the president. He's not here anyway. He's out raising money. He ranks above everybody on the they rank above everybody on the campus. Football players are second. Partly it is that the face of the basketball player gets known on television. There are only probably 12 to a team as opposed to 120, as in football. Football is really much more like the old Knights of old, isn't it? The way the armament now is. You never see their faces. Anyway, okay, you don't have Division I sports. You don't have to worry about NCAA objecting to the fact that some agent has given some player's money and some player's mother an SUV. Those things happen. But you do have hockey, which rather interests me. I think, was it just a short time ago, maybe this year too, the NCAA champions? Division I. I got interested. So I called around and I got a list of the roster of the Harvard ice hockey team. I thought it was wonderful that there are so many young men from places like Thornhill, Ontario, Blenheim, Ontario, Montreal, who became interested in Harvard. And many of them, these rosters, it shows team last played for. I figured, they probably went to Groton, Andover, maybe Exeter. Oddly enough, the team they last played for with teams like the Aurora Tigers, the Thornhill Islanders, the Chatham Juniors. These are teams in Canada, but we also have them in Minnesota and Michigan. They're a step above. Believe me, they are amateur, but they're a step above. These are for players who have outgrown high school, and it's like AAU summer basketball, if you're familiar with that. These are serious players, and I just think it says so much for Harvard that you could find that many and attract that many highly skilled and I'm sure really sturdy Canadians who can play ice hockey and also have that median SAT score of 1480. I take my hat off. I take my hat off to you. But why does sports even here mean so very, very much? And it does everywhere. It's because of that genetic memory. The fighting male. And women get just as excited in many places, I can't speak for Harvard, in many places as the men, just as they did after the battles in the year 1000, the year 300 BC in Greek in Greek time. The male spirit doesn't die. Manliness never changes its form. Maybe it is a genetic, maybe it is a genetic heritage. If it is, you better let your boys go hunting. You better let them join the officer corps. It's the world, just as Thomas Hobbes has not been improved upon. The human animal has never changed its spots. Thank you so very much. I didn't mean to go over time. I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you very much.
We have time for 2 quick questions, one from each microphone, please. Go to the microphone, and please identify yourself, and keep the question short.
Again, please forgive me for letting this run over, but.
Hi, my name is Craig Lambert, and I wanted to ask about your very accurate, I think, mentioning of dissing at the beginning. Could this also pertain at an institutional level? And I'm thinking about, you said you like things that apply to you. The New Yorker magazine, your celebrated piece, Tiny Mummies, for those who may not have seen it, 1966, I think it was.
65. Yeah.
65, which encapsulate, you might say, expose certain moribund characteristics of the New Yorker. Now, it seems that they've never gotten over it over there. I mean, anytime you see Tom Wolfe mentioned in the New Yorker magazine, there's no opportunity to get in a jab is ever missed. This is 34 years later. And I just wondered whether there's an institutional memory as well, and did you diss them in a way and they've just never been able to get over it?
Well, those of that era who are still vertical have never forgotten. And although you really can't, I cannot in good conscience equate what happens in the area of the warrior mentality with the journalistic mentality. Well, people, yeah, writers can be dissed, yeah.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Barbara Mack, and I'm an alumna of the Kennedy School. And I was just wondering, you spoke a lot about the military, but not much about the counterculture. And I would be very grateful for one story about Ken Kesey.
Ken Kesey, wow, my God.
That's electric Kool-Aid for those of you who are under 30.
Well, actually, my favorite Ken Kesey story doesn't directly involve Ken, but he was there. One night, this was in New York City. Kesey was in town. Neal Cassady was still living. And Neal Cassady was driving this car. I was in it. Kesey was in it. Just being in a car with Neal Cassady driving it, believe me, is an experience. But also in the car was Tiny Tim. Remember, I don't know if you remember Tiny Tim, but he was this 6'6", very strange-looking guy who had hair down to his shoulder blades, very wild hurricane hair. And he played the ukulele and sang in falsetto. I'll tiptoe through the tulips. That was one of his signature songs. And so this big discussion about drugs is going on in the car. And Cassady is... and this was a great era of hip intimidation, in which no one dared admit that he wasn't hip, or dared show and indicate. It was like almost like being masculine. I mean, there was another. In a way, that's the counterculture. It was, your hipness was as powerful as your desire to be hip was as powerful as the desire to be masculine in what we've been talking about tonight. And so finally, Cassady turns and looks back at, still driving, but he looks back at Tim and he says, "Tim, you know your problem. You don't take drugs." He said, "If you would take drugs, if you start off a little mescaline, maybe a little psilocybin, something. Just start off with that. It would straighten you out. You'd be a different human being, and you'd love me for the advice." And Tiny Tim says in total sincerity, but Mr. Cassidy, I always call him Mr. Cassidy, but Mr. Cassidy, that would defile my body. Cassidy had no answer. No, in the world of hip, nobody has an answer for a true straight talker who raises a moral argument. But Mr. Cassidy, that would defy. If you had seen that body, I mean, but I knew that that moment that I was in the presence of a kind of Zen master, Tiny Tim. Thank you.